Good morning, everybody. Welcome to HRI. I'm glad you found this room okay. Just to make sure you're in the right room, you were in workshop number 2, advancing HRI research and benchmarking through open source ecosystems. We are here today on behalf of our organizers, myself, Adam Norton from the University of Massachusetts Lowell, Holly Yanko, also from UMass Lowell in the back, Aaron, who I think is currently Vanna Whiting to get people into the room, and Bert Pally from WPI, who may be attending remotely at some point, although I think it's 4 or 5 a.m. at home right now, so probably not. This is a workshop sponsored by National Science Foundation through their Pathways Through Open Source Ecosystems project that is funding us to be here today. So just quick logistics do we know where the bathrooms are in this building? Okay, they're over that way. There's water in the back. Wi-Fi network is MB guest with password conference. And there's coffee breaks scheduled, which I assume will be out in this kind of main area.
11.
Very good. For presentations, you all can either load up your files onto my computer here, or you can join Zoom remotely and just share from your own machine, and we'll show it up on the screen here. For anyone participating remotely, you can either post questions in the Zoom chat that we'll try to answer during the Q&A, or we have our Slack space, which I'll be keeping an eye on throughout the day. And in case anyone hasn't joined the Slack space already, there's our QR code. I'm sure everyone wants to join more Slack spaces. So we have a pretty packed schedule today. I'm going to update this once I'm off screen. Everything's about 15 minutes off right now, but we'll be fine. We'll just eat until lunch a little bit. And we're going to start.
Eat until lunch.
I'm sorry?
Eat until lunch.
Did I say eat into lunch?
Into lunch.
Come on.
Honey.
And we'll start with a quick introduction of everybody around the room. We'll start with those physically in the room. So again, Adam Norton, UMass Lowell. What I'm hoping to take away from this workshop is this is the first kind of official workshop of this open source ecosystem project. So we're hoping to spend a lot of time identifying some of the choke points and challenges related to open source and benchmarking for HRI. And that's my goal for takeaway. So we'll start over here.
Hello, I'm Peter Masters, and I'm from King's College in London, and one of our talks is up. And what I'm hoping to take away is we're proposing a model for benchmarking use case scenarios. So any input on that will be very welcome.
Thank you.
I'm a colleague of Peter's. I'm Victoria from King's College in London, where I work in the Trusted Autonomous Systems Hub, and like Peter, interested in the benchmarking work that you've all done, and I'm particularly keen to hear about the challenges that you've experienced and how you address them.
Great. My name is Penny Edmoney. I am from Carnegie Mellon University. You'll hear from me in a minute. And I'm particularly interested in ways we can benchmark social navigation and assistive driving applications. Oh, yes. Your turn. You show us how it's done.
Yeah, so I am Mong Yuzhong. I'm a PhD student in Uppsala University. Here, I actually didn't sign up for this workshop, so I'm not really familiar with the topic, but I will be the student volunteer for the morning. If you have any question, you can ask me. I will try my best to help you.
Hello, my name is Marco Moretta. I'm from UTH Stockholm. I'm a PhD student here. I hope what I hope to take away is learning more about benchmarking, specifically for the topic I'm interested in, which is documentation.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jansodeti Vishwa. I'm from Kazakhstan, Lowell University. I'm a research assistant here. And today I would like to get some ideas about open source assets available in this field, HRI, and we have our project, our system, our design system, and we'd like to know how we can improve our open source data sets, maybe to get some more ideas about it.
Hello, good morning. My name is Cengiz. I'm from Jagiellonian University in Krakow, Poland, which is Cognitive Science Department. Recently, we're establishing a new lab. It is eye tracking and neuroimaging, brain imaging facilities for HRI2. So I'm here to understand the context of the open source ecosystem.
I'm Nick Walker, I'm a PhD student at the University of Washington. I'm interested in learning about any standards or other ways that HRI researchers can do better about measuring.
Hi, I'm Tapu. I'm an assistant professor at Cornell University. And in this workshop, I'm hoping to share some of the open source ecosystems that we have been developing in the lab and then learn more about what others have been up to.
Hi, I'm Lashmar Khalid. I'm a master's student at Johns Hopkins, and I want to learn more about benchmarking in HRI specifically.
Hey, I'm Matt Boyd with MIT. I'm a research engineer in interactive robotics group. And I'm interested in continuing the conversation here about how we can make research easier for HR researchers through better open source tools.
Holly Yanko, University of Massachusetts Lowell, and with Adam and Aaron, who's still working on the grant work to try to figure out how we could get funds to hopefully develop a great open source ecosystem for manipulation.
Hi, I'm Bharini. I work at Open Robotics in California, USA, and I am working in open source robotic software. And with this workshop, I hope to learn some open problems that are there in benchmarking some studies and HRI research, and especially what would take to have a standard simulator for this research as well.
Hello everyone, I'm Ahmed from India. I'm a bachelor student. I'm here for this workshop because I'm working on a project of surgical robotics. So I thought I could find some open source information here from all of you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Vincenzo from Sapienza University of Rome. And I'm a PhD student, and I hope to learn more about standardizing strategies for benchmarking and for robotic benchmark system.
Wonderful. For those on the line, Andrea.
Yeah. Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm Andrea Cavallaro, currently director of EDIAP Research Institute in Martigny, Switzerland, and professor at EPFL in Lausanne. I'm interested in human-robot interactions, and we have run a 4-year project of which I will show results in 45 minutes or so. And I'm interested in learning from other experiences in benchmarking HRI topics, but also I'd like to make some followers today on the dataset benchmarks and a topic we have worked on over the years, and for which we have already a pretty sizable community. I hope the community today will grow. Thank you.
Thank you. Sachini.
Hi, everybody. Good morning and very nice to see all of you. I am Sachini, a researcher from the Trustworthy Autonomous Systems Hub at King's College London. What I'm hoping to get from today's workshop is learn a little bit about this aspect of benchmarking in HRI, particularly in the area of trusted or trustworthy HRI. Thank you.
Thank you. And I hope I am pronouncing this right. Nazirki.
So, hi, my name is Nazirke. I'm from Kazakhstan. With Jean Saoulé, we're working in Human Robot Interaction Lab in Nazarbayev University. I'm on my final year of PhD, and I'm planning to do the postdoc. Therefore, I hope this workshop will provide me the good opportunity to see what kind of research I also work with and continue my skills. Sorry for the noise.
No, can't hear anything. Great. Thank you. We just had someone else join who's not connected to audio yet. Joey Huang, you want to give a quick introduction? Joey Huang, can you hear us? All right, we'll come back. All right. Oh, yes. Quick introduction? I think so.
Oh, sorry.
Just
Just landing.
Us too.
It was difficult to get here.
Yeah.
Everybody's pretty that.
Yeah.
I've been up and down 3 times already. Okay, hi.
My name is Michael Gross and I'm from Power Robotics. And I'm going to actually present the paper this afternoon on benchmarking section on developing open source software. Build a bigger community in terms of robotic development. Thank you.
Very good. And our last entry into the room. Quick introduction.
Ross, you have to use the mic.
Oh,
Or you can just speak
okay.
very loud.
I'm Ross Mead. I'm from a robot software company called Semio.
Beautiful. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you everyone for choosing to spend your workshop day with us. I quickly want to just kind of reset kind of the context for the workshop because there's a lot of words getting thrown around for benchmarking ecosystems, open source. And all of you either submitted to or chose to attend this workshop because hopefully you agree with most of these sentiments that we all kind of agree we need some systematic development and benchmarking methodologies. And there's a lot of other efforts, including kind of a concurrent workshop right now around HRI standards and test methods that are looking to address this. But also on top of that is we need effective mechanisms to share and collaborate, not just someone publishing that we have the standard, but actual ways to bring all of that together. And it's our belief that we can do this through some type of unified effort for development, utilization, and dissemination of open source assets. So in this workshop, we do want to try to lay the groundwork for the existing open source efforts, ecosystems, and ways that we can kind of intersect between HRI and manipulation. So a quick kind of note about manipulation. There's the main kind of context for the grant that's driving us here is around robotic manipulation. HRI obviously being something that can involve manipulation. We know that not all talks today are going to involve manipulation, but there are larger, best practices that can be gleaned, issues that are being faced. So we're just kind of keeping that in mind, but you'll see that word manipulation around a lot. But we're talking very generally about robotics, just understanding it's not going to apply to everybody. But there's kind of 3 phrases that we're going to mention a lot, which is ecosystem, benchmarking, and open source. And just to provide kind of how we've been viewing this is as kind of 2 groups of the various open source assets that are developed and available to the community, and then kind of the activities that they drive, robotics development and benchmarking. And between these 2, the ecosystem is formed, some activities for those to go together. So when we're saying open source assets, we kind of have these 4 broad groups. Physical open source assets like object sets like YCB, hardware setups like the Yale Open Hand design, digital, which are data sets typically generated from those assets, or maybe graph data sets, which are very common. Instructional around more task protocols, benchmarking protocols, test methods, and functional, more your packages you would find from ROS for MoveIt, for GPD, or whatever it was. And we have these arrows drawn between here just to kind of show, you can use physical open source assets to drive your instructional ones. You use your functional ones to evaluate, blah, blah, blah. They're all interconnected. But all of those can be used for kind of these 3 larger groups of development and benchmarking. Experiments, whether that is in your lab or as part of some larger benchmarking effort. Competitions, where there are series of competitors going around some sort of common challenge, which typically involves some sort of instructional asset. Maybe some physical and functional ones are specified as well. And of course, publications that can include all that material. So when we say ecosystem, we're trying to look at all of the kind of relationships between these 2 large groups and how they can inform one another. Any questions about this before we move on? Anyone disagree with this breakup? Is there anything that's missing? Okay. You can interrupt me at any time. So with that, we're going to start with kind of the way to open this workshop, which is the kind of results of a survey that we recently ran that all of you have probably been pestered with taking multiple times. And if you've taken it, thank you very much. If you haven't, you can take it during the workshop. So for the last about 2 months, month and a half, we've been running a survey to collect data on all of those topics and kind of understanding all the different researcher and developer experiences around them. The structure of that survey is ask questions about demographics, feedback on the current landscape, and then feedback on proposed new activities. All of the questions were using 5-point Likert scales and had open response. For today, we're only going to focus on some of the initial feedback we got on the current landscape, the new activities to solve them. Maybe we'll talk about those kind of throughout the workshop. But today, about 100 respondents, fairly decent spread across the globe. And, you know, a lot from the US, a lot from European countries as well. And this is going to stay open and kind of remain throughout the year. We had people kind of categorize themselves as kind of how they use open source, whether they are users, someone who just downloads and integrates it into their research, developers who create new open source assets, or contributors who maybe iterate on top of existing open source assets. Unsurprisingly, most everyone who took the survey was a user, some of them serving multiple roles. And our organization types, no surprise, lots of academia, a little bit of industry, hoping to get those numbers up more and more. For the domains, and you know, these are all multiple selections, so all these numbers are going to add to more than 100. We have actually a pretty decent representation of HRI, manipulation, perception, and you know, no surprise that those three groups can kind of touch a lot of different areas, particularly perception and manipulation you can use in all of these other areas for humanoids, for wearable robotics, etc. And on applications, again, pretty good because we're at HRI, a lot of assistive robotics, manufacturing, logistics and warehousing, the types of applications we would kind of expect to see for this audience. And there's a couple others that got mentioned here, but I think it's a fairly decent spread thus far. So now for the next several slides, what I'm going to do is just kind of step through the results we have thus far on this survey and quickly kind of point out some of our initial takeaways. And this is not a full-on data analysis. The way we're kind of looking at this is everything in blue is any respondent who did not indicate being part of the HRI domain. And everything in orange is just those that did. So it's actually a pretty even spread. And our first item was about whether barriers were faced attempting to integrate open source assets. And ultimately, what we kind of see across here is there's somewhat more barriers that seem to be faced for HRI research compared to other domains. Some of the open responses we got to indicate this is just pointing out some of the importance of open source assets, that this can be, you know, an impedance to state of the art, and that ultimately reproducibility remains challenging. Some of our other results from the other questions are going to illuminate this a little bit more. Second one, whether there was a limitation by lack of relevant open source assets. Obviously, there's a lot of open source assets available. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're all going to be applicable to your research. Now, compared from non-HRI to HRI, it's pretty similar frequency, which, you know, pretty much everything usually falls around somewhat, but the other groups, you know, about equivalent. And actually, there's a really interesting open response comment from here that the popularity of some existing open source assets make it difficult to have new ones get taken up by the community. So there's a handful of open source assets we probably all are familiar with. YCB, MoveIt, you know, very kind of common ones that are used throughout the field. I hadn't thought of this kind of takeaway that, like, yeah, that's great, those are there, but because they're used so broadly, is it actually making it harder for newer assets to maybe fill in those gaps if they're not able to? So something good to keep in mind. Related to this, are people actually utilizing open source assets in their research? And seeing less frequent usage, again, just from our pool of respondents in HRI compared to other domains. And some of the comments around here that seem related to this are really about the fact that there are not a lot of comprehensive and detailed tutorials available, or not a lot of well-documented open source assets. Now, some literature kind of helps support this. So actually, the Ross user survey from 2020, I know there was one that was just run in, I think, 2022. I don't think I've seen the results for it yet. Some of the takeaways were from those users that, unsurprisingly, tutorials are preferred over things like guides. No one likes cheat sheets. Videos are good for skilled users, which unsurprisingly, you know, this kind of correlates with what people want to see, but we're not really seeing it. And then on another recently published survey on URDFs, the Universal Robot Descriptor Format, found that there is a lot of lack of documentation across those, which any of us who are using ROS or Gazebo in some form have likely interacted with URDF maybe interacted with this lack of documentation. Now, on top of using them, there's first just learning that they're even available. So, back to that comment earlier about some of those popular ones kind of overtaking it. So learning about the availability of new open source assets, pretty similar in HRI compared to other domains. But similar to our previous comments, only aware of open source assets like YCB, and there are others, but not well maintained, and assistance from authors is not available. I think that comment actually said reaching out to authors warrants no response or something a little more aggressive, but same sentiment. And more importantly, that just because it's available doesn't mean that it's usable. So, this comes to mind, should there be a standard way in which you have to specify your open source assets, certain formats or structures you need to follow? Can there be more of this ecosystem approach to kind of help the usability of those assets? Now, this question, I contribute to open source for robotic manipulation. I realize as we were reviewing the results for this, that not everyone answering this contributes to robotic manipulation, but may contribute to other open source areas. So that this is going to be a little tainted in our results here, specifically when we're looking at, HRI compared to others. But even with that context, fewer contributions in HRI compared to others. And someone had a comment that the practices behind the acquisition and release of other assets are not provided. So this makes me wonder if, because the development practices or the release practices of certain open source assets are not maybe well documented, does that make it hard for others in the field to contribute equally? That's on open source. Now we get into benchmarking. So do I benchmark my robotic manipulation research to others in the field? So it's kind of a complex answer here. Just it's mostly looking at the never and the frequently, which is basically if people are benchmarking in HRI, they seem to be doing it more frequently than those in other fields. But if they're not benchmarking, there's a lot of people who are not benchmarking in HRI at all. And just one kind of comment for that was there was no benchmarking standard for soft robots. So maybe that's due to a lack of relevant comparable benchmarks. Again, a lot of benchmarks published, but can we actually compare them? It seems to be more frequent in HRI compared to the other domains. And we had a comment here about kind of this tight connection between the data set that gets generated, the application that it's used for, making it really hard to adapt to a specific setup. Again, is this a documentation problem? Is this because we're doing too narrow of use cases? They're not generalizable. I'm sure there's something we can change there. Now, someone mentioned simulation earlier. So is anyone's current research limited by robot simulation capabilities? We didn't see a huge difference between HRI and other domains. And someone pointed out specifically that contact simulation for assembly is spectacularly poor. I agree with that. And looking at a study that was published in 2020, I think this was also based on a survey specifically looking at robotic simulators, that there's a lot of challenges with time and resources. Reproducing the results is very difficult, both in simulators and transferring to the real world. A lot of computational resource costs. And for using it for testing purposes, they're not very reliable. And then our last item is about robot hardware. And is it limited by access to robot hardware? Now, in general, seeing kind of fewer hardware access limitations in HRI compared to other domains. But someone did point out, yes, obviously there is the economic and cost factors related to hardware. Now, I didn't find an existing study specifically about hardware access, but there was one about open robot hardware for kind of open source hardware that you can build. And just some of the findings for users that, requires a lot of time and labor for replication, not a lot of long-term support, requires comprehensive documentation, and there's a lot of questions of reliability and robustness. So to summarize all those findings, in HRI, we're seeing fewer contributions, fewer usage, and fewer limitations to hardware access. There's more barriers faced when integrating, more researchers that are not benchmarking at all, and a lack of comparable benchmarks. And then similar to the other fields, lack of relevant open source assets, learning about the availability, the amount of benchmarking if it's performed at all, and simulation limitations. So with all of that said, if you would like to contribute to this survey, it is still running. It should take you about 15 minutes. And I wanted to open up our day with that because those are kind of all of the topics that we've been discussing kind of as our project team. This being our first workshop to invite kind of others in on a larger scale to share their experiences, give us their feedback. And pause there for any questions. Yes.
Did people point to any role model parallel domains in the responses?
So the question was, did people point to any parallel role model domains in their responses? So the one that we've most been more investigating is on computer vision. And there's been some studies out of Peter Cork did a kind of a what can computer vision or what can roboticists learn from the computer vision domain, and making comments like having standard data sets, having requirements for publications to have to compare to other benchmarks can be kind of some of those motivating factors. We've heard that a lot, that if you can get the support of a larger body, standards organization, conference track, journal publication, to require certain constructs within your papers, maybe that could help push it forward. I think one of the big takeaways from that paper as well was to move from experimentation to evaluation. And I'm sure they had very particular definitions for both of those words. But so computer vision, I think, is our closest kind of domain we're striving for. Yeah.
How have you distributed the survey for the most part?
The question was, how do we distribute the survey? Robotics Worldwide, Ross Discourse, largely kind of sending to some of our peers, just through our networks of people who purchase YCB kits, people who, but it is fairly, it's going to be slanted towards, I think, more people within our closest network.
We also gave it out at the IIII Robotics and AI Bridge program.
Okay.
So that was another way to reach out into the community, but we're happy to have huge mailing lists with your friends. Happy to send out more widely.
Yeah, you've got ideas, we're open.
Well, we've got a goal because we want to get more funding from the National Science Foundation. It's on every single US state. So if you know people doing open source in, say, like Alaska or Nebraska or North Dakota, let us know. We want to hit every state.
Yeah,
of the US.
even though this map shows Alaska, that's just the US. It's not, we didn't actually get anything in
We
Alaska.
want to hit the whole world, but the National Science Foundation, we want to hit every state.
That's right. Yes, Henry.
So this is more of a question. I would use the microphone. You mentioned computer vision and their heavy benchmarking culture, and I'm wondering if it's worth thinking as a community about whether we want to, whether there's a rabbit hole that we might fall down in that direction, because I think that a lot of computer vision now is, the critiques are that they are playing to the benchmark rather than actually progressing the science. So I think that it's worth also, while we think about what benchmarks to create, also we're thinking about how we avoid falling into the same trap.
That is a very good point.
I would really welcome us falling into that a little bit more than we already are. I'm just saying, like, we don't actually have the balance right now. Like, we have no trap essentially. And yes, sorry.
Yeah,
The way I
that's
was just through. So do the right one. Ross.
One more question. Are you asking any questions or, sorry, are you asking any questions around licensing structures?
We have not yet. We have had some general discussions with some of the founders of Ross and the like about kind of how they have run their licensing structures, governance, things like that. We haven't gotten to that stage yet, but very interested if you have comments.
For what it's worth, one of the major barriers for industry to use a lot of these things is that, like Ross, for example, while core Ross is because BSD, it's the Wild West when it comes to licenses and the rest of the ecosystem. So that is alone a huge barrier for them to even consider it.
Good to know. All right, any questions from our remote participants? All right, so just to let everyone know, we are about 15 minutes off cycle, but we're at 9:45, so we're gonna go right into that next talk that was supposed to be 9:30.